Now, in this lesson, we are going to talk about how do we charge insulators through rubbing. Now, just a summary or just a recap. To charge means to take or add electrons to an atom. So let's just do a recall. When we have a neutral atom, it is when the number of electrons is equal to the number of protons. If we have a positively charged atom, or rather, if we want to make an atom positively charged, then we got to make sure that we remove electrons so that there are lesser electrons than protons. Now, finally, if we want to make an atom negatively charged, then we must make sure that we transfer more electrons onto the insulator so that the number of electrons are more than protons. That is what is known as charging. So whenever we talk about charging an object, we're really either adding electrons or taking away electrons. And previously we mentioned that insulators, the electrons in the insulators are not free-flowing. They don't move freely within the material. So therefore, if you want the electrons to be transferred, you need to introduce friction. You need to introduce some form of force to force the electrons to be transferred. So let's take a closer look. How does rubbing produce that needed force? Okay, so rubbing produces friction. So let's take, for example, a very common example. Let's say we have a piece of cloth that's made of silk, and we know that it is an insulator. And we have a glass rod, also an insulator. Now, at the very beginning, they are neutral because there is nothing that has been done to them. They are in its natural state. So we know that the number of electrons and protons in the silk and the glass rod, they are equal in its own object. So let's say if silk has 3 electrons, then I also know that there are 3 protons. So let's say for the glass, if there are 4 electrons, then it should be balanced by 4 protons. So right now, at the beginning, they are both in its neutral state. So what happens is when you rub the silk and the glass rod together, electrons are going to be transferred. So if you see this slide as I've just included, you realize that some materials give away electrons more easily than some of the other materials. So example, if you were to take a look at the first combination between the glass and the silk, you realize that after the glass is rubbed with the silk, the glass becomes positively charged and the silk becomes negatively charged. Now, what does this tell you? When I rub glass and silk together, glass becomes positively charged. So it means that it has lost electrons. For silk, after rubbing, it becomes negatively charged. It means that the silk has actually gained electrons. Now let's go back to our example above. Okay, now let's take a look at the example again. So we have the silk and we have the glass rod. Okay, so after rubbing, the glass becomes positively charged. It means that in the process of rubbing, so this is before rubbing. So before you rub the glass and the silk together, they were neutral, equal negative, equal positive. Okay, so during the rubbing, this is what happens. So due to the material itself, glass actually was more willing to give away the electrons. Okay, so during the rubbing itself, this is what happens. During the rubbing, the electrons actually gets transferred over where they were in contact. Okay, so wherever there were contact between the silk and the glass rod, electrons start to be transferred over to the silk. So the silk starts to gain electrons. So silk gains electrons in the process of rubbing, whereas the glass loses electrons in the process of rubbing. Now, why, you will ask? Now, this has got to do with the material itself, which is actually beyond the syllabus. Okay, so therefore, what happens is that the question will usually tell you what happens after the rubbing so that you can infer which one has lost or gained electrons. Okay, So as a summary, the silk and the glass rod were neutral to begin with. They were both neutral before the rubbing, which means equal electrons, equal protons. During the rubbing, electrons starts to be transferred from the glass to the silk in the area of contact. Okay, electrons starts to get transferred. So therefore, after rubbing, the silk would be negatively charged as it has gained the electrons. So the silk becomes negatively charged because now it has more electrons than before. The protons remain the same number because there is no change to the protons that's right inside the nucleus. Whereas the glass rod that has been giving away the electrons will have now lesser number of electrons than the protons. So therefore, the number of protons still remain the same, but the electrons is definitely lesser. So the glass is positively charged. So this is the method of charging insulators using friction. Hope you found this lesson useful.